The courthouse steps gleamed under the late morning sun, polished stone reflecting light so harsh it felt unforgiving. To Emily Carter, it looked like a stage, one she had never asked to stand on. She adjusted the collar of her plain beige coat and slowed her pace, every step heavier than the last. A small group stood near the railing, dressed in tailored coats and confidence. Diane Harrington, elegant and sharp-eyed, spoke animatedly while her sister, Linda Harrington, laughed behind a manicured hand. Travis Harrington leaned against the stone, scrolling his phone, smirking as if this were all entertainment. Before we continue this powerful story, if you enjoy billionaire stories, hidden identity dramas, and life-changing twists like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel Riker Malou right now. New stories are uploaded regularly, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Go ahead, subscribe to Riker Malou, like this video, and turn on notifications. Alright, let's continue. They were Blake Harrington's family. Blake himself stood a few steps away, checking his watch, his posture relaxed, his dark suit flawless. He looked like a man who believed today marked a victory. When he noticed Emily, his eyes flicked up briefly. No warmth, no hesitation. Just acknowledgement. "You're late," Blake said calmly. Emily stopped at the base of the steps. "Traffic," she replied, her voice steady. Diane Harrington's lips curved into a thin smile. "Traffic," she repeated dismissively. "Of course." Linda chuckled. "She always has an excuse." Emily said nothing. She had learned silence was safer. Blake stepped down toward her, stopping just short. "Let's get this over with," he said, as if finalizing a business deal. Inside, the courthouse smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Their footsteps echoed down the hallway, drawing glances from strangers who would never know her name, only that she was the woman walking beside Blake Harrington on divorce day. They were led into a narrow conference room. A long table separated the two sides like a fault line. Emily sat alone on one side. Blake took the opposite seat, flanked by his mother and aunt as if he needed reinforcement. Two lawyers followed. Emily's attorney, Claire Reynolds, placed her briefcase neatly beside her chair. Blake's lawyer, Richard Halstead, smiled professionally and laid a thick folder in front of Emily. "This contains the final agreement," Halstead said smoothly. Diane leaned back, crossing her legs. "Assuming she understands it." Travis snorted. "That's generous." Emily kept her hands folded in her lap. Claire leaned closer. "Remember," she whispered, "we can pause if you want to review anything." Emily shook her head slightly. "I'm ready." Blake glanced at her, surprised. "Eager to leave?" he asked. "I'm finished," Emily replied. Halstead cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrington." "Ms. Carter," Emily corrected quietly. A pause flickered across the table. "Of course," Halstead said. "Ms. Carter." The agreement reflects the separation of premarital assets and property owned solely by Mr. Harrington. Linda smirked. "Meaning she walks away empty-handed." Diane nodded approvingly. "Fair is fair. She didn't bring anything into this marriage." Blake said nothing. Claire opened her mouth to object, but Emily lifted her hand gently. "It's fine." Claire stared at her. "Emily, I want to sign." Blake leaned back, a satisfied smile tugging at his mouth. "See," he said to his family. "No drama." Emily opened the folder. Page after page spelled out what she was relinquishing: the Harrington estate she had lived in but never owned, the account she'd never been allowed to manage, the social standing she'd borrowed but never truly held. She read every word. She was giving up the house she'd cleaned herself because Blake didn't like too many people around. She was giving up the dinners where she'd been silently evaluated. She was giving up holidays where she'd smiled while being reminded she was lucky to be included. There was a clause forbidding her from speaking publicly. Another stating she had no claim to Blake's future ventures or earnings. Emily turned the pages slowly. Diane leaned toward Blake. "I told you. She never had the backbone to fight." Emily heard it. She didn't respond. Halstead slid a pen across the table. "Sign here." Initial each page. Emily picked it up. The pen felt light, almost insignificant. Claire whispered, "This is your last chance." Emily met her eyes. "I'm okay." She signed her name, Emily Carter. Clear. Unshaken. She initialed each page without hesitation. Blake watched closely, waiting, perhaps for tears, or anger, or regret. None came. When she finished, Emily set the pen down carefully. Halstead smiled. "Mr. Harrington." Blake took his time. "You sure you don't want anything?" he asked Emily. "A little support? Something to help you start over?" Linda laughed. "She'll manage. People like her always do." Emily looked directly at Blake. "I'm sure." Blake's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Then he signed. The folder closed with a soft thud. Diane stood. "Well," she said, smoothing her coat, "that's that." She glanced at Emily one last time. "Good luck," she added, already turning away. Emily rose. Claire touched her arm gently. "Call me if you need anything." "Thank you," Emily said sincerely. Outside, the sun felt colder than before. Blake paused at the door. "You'll regret this," he said, not looking at her. Emily opened the door. "No," she said softly. She stepped outside. Behind her, Blake Harrington walked away convinced he had won, unaware that the woman he dismissed had just closed a chapter she had outgrown. Emily's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. A message from a number she hadn't seen in over a decade. "Emily, come home. It's time. Margaret Bellamy." Emily stared at the screen, her heartbeat steady, her expression unreadable. She slipped the phone away and walked forward, alone, unburdened, while behind her the Harrington family laughed, celebrating an ending that was only the beginning. Emily Carter didn't go to the apartment she'd rented in advance. Instead, she drove aimlessly, letting the city blur past her windshield while the weight of the courthouse slowly lifted from her chest. The silence in the car was loud, but it wasn't empty. For the first time in years, no one was watching her, correcting her posture, reminding her where she stood. Her phone rested in the cup holder. The message from Margaret Bellamy glowed faintly on the screen, even though she hadn't opened it again. "Come home. It's time." Emily knew what home meant. She exited the highway and drove toward the coast, where the air grew cleaner and the buildings thinned. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as the familiar gate came into view. Black iron, understated, guarded but never flashy. No sign announced what lay beyond it. It never had. The guard recognized her immediately. "Welcome back, Miss Bellamy," he said gently, pressing a button. The gate opened. Emily inhaled slowly as she drove down the long private road lined with old oak trees. 12 years. That was how long she'd stayed away from this place, not because she'd been forced out, but because she'd chosen to leave. The estate came into view gradually, revealed through the trees like something remembered rather than discovered. White stone. Clean lines. Quiet confidence. No excess, no shouting wealth. She parked and stepped out. The front doors opened before she reached them. Margaret Bellamy stood waiting, her silver hair neatly pulled back, posture straight despite her age. Her eyes, sharp, warm, impossibly observant, locked onto Emily's face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret opened her arms. Emily crossed the distance without thinking, folding into her grandmother's embrace like a child who had finally stopped pretending she wasn't tired. "You did it," Margaret murmured. "You stayed true to yourself." Emily swallowed. "I signed everything." Margaret pulled back and studied her carefully. "And how do you feel?" Emily searched for the right word. "Lighter." Margaret smiled, not with triumph, but with pride. "Good." They walked together through the halls Emily had once known better than any place in the world. The house smelled the same: polished wood, fresh air, something quietly permanent. Staff moved discreetly, greeting Emily with respectful nods but no fanfare. That had always been the Bellamy way. They settled in the sunroom overlooking the gardens. Tea appeared without being asked. Margaret gestured for Emily to sit. "Tell me," she said, "did they ever guess?" Emily shook her head. Not once. Margaret nodded. Good. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They thought I was nothing. Ordinary. Replaceable. Margaret's eyes hardened slightly, not in anger, but in understanding. That was the point. Emily met her gaze. You really believe that? Margaret leaned back. Emily, when you came to me at 22 and told me you wanted to live without the Bellamy name, without the money, without protection, I knew exactly why. She paused. You didn't want to know what you could have. You wanted to know who you were. Emily's throat tightened. You wanted to know if people would love you without leverage, Margaret continued. If you could survive being underestimated. If your values would hold when no one was watching. Emily looked down at her hands. I thought if I told him, if I told any of them, they'd never see me. Just the name. And were you right? Margaret asked. Emily nodded slowly. Yes. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then you learned exactly what you needed to learn. Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Emily asked the question she had been avoiding. Why now? Margaret's grip tightened. Because my time is shorter than yours. Emily looked up sharply. Grandma. Margaret lifted a hand. I'm not afraid, she said calmly. And you shouldn't be either. The Bellamy Group has been prepared for this transition for years. Emily's pulse quickened. Prepared how? Margaret held her gaze steadily. By waiting for you to be ready. Emily felt the room tilt, just slightly. Your brother has been overseeing operations, Margaret continued. Nathan understands numbers, scale, strategy. But the foundation, our social initiatives, ethics oversight, long-term impact, that was always meant for you. Emily shook her head. I walked away. You stepped away, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. Margaret rose and walked toward the window. The Bellamy Group is worth several $1 billion, Emily. Textile manufacturing, sustainable materials, real estate holdings, private investments. But wealth without values destroys itself. She turned back. You lived without protection. You endured humiliation. You chose dignity when you had no reason to. That's why I trust you. Emily's voice trembled despite herself. They treated me like I didn't matter. Margaret's eyes softened. And you never once used your name to stop them. Emily remembered Diane Harrington's smile. Blake's indifference. The laughter in that conference room. I wanted to know, Emily said quietly, if I could walk away with nothing and still be okay. Margaret smiled. And are you? Emily thought of the courthouse doors closing behind her. The relief. The message waiting in her pocket. Yes, she said. I am. Margaret nodded once. Then it's time. Over the next days, Emily was reintroduced to a world she had deliberately abandoned. Not the glamour, there was very little of that, but the machinery behind influence. Boardrooms. Reports. Briefings. Quiet conversations that moved entire markets. Nathan Bellamy joined them, calm and composed, greeting Emily with a warm hug. You look different, he said. Emily smiled faintly. So do you. He gestured toward a stack of documents. Wait until you see what you've been spared. Emily learned that while she'd been enduring dismissal in a marriage that never truly saw her, the Bellamy Foundation had been expanding its reach, education programs, labor protections, sustainable supply chains. And all of it had been waiting. Margaret watched Emily absorb the information without interruption. Finally, Emily looked up. Blake doesn't know. No, Margaret said. And he won't, until it no longer matters. Emily didn't ask what that meant. Across the city, Blake Harrington raised a glass at a private club, celebrating his freedom. He told anyone who would listen that he was finally unburdened. He never noticed the emails that went unanswered. The calls returned a little slower. The subtle shift in tone. And Emily, once invisible, sat in a quiet office overlooking the ocean, her name embossed on a folder she hadn't opened yet. Bellamy Foundation, co-director appointment. She closed her eyes. The life she had hidden was ready to claim her. And Blake Harrington had no idea that the woman he had discarded had just stepped back into a world that would soon decide his future. Power didn't announce itself when Emily Bellamy stepped fully into her new role. It moved quietly. From conference rooms with tinted windows. From polite emails that ended conversations without explanation. From decisions made over morning coffee in offices Blake Harrington had never been invited into. Emily noticed it first in the way people listened. At her first executive meeting as co-director of the Bellamy Foundation, the room fell silent the moment she entered, not out of fear, but respect. Senior advisors who had guided multinational operations for decades paused, waiting for her to speak. She didn't rush them. Emily had learned patience in places far removed from boardrooms, standing alone at social events, being ignored at dinners, swallowing insults disguised as jokes. That patience now became her advantage. "Our priority stays the same," she said calmly. "Ethical supply chains. Worker dignity. Long-term sustainability. If growth comes at the cost of integrity, we don't pursue it." Heads nodded. No objections. Nathan watched from across the table, quietly impressed. "You didn't change," he said later. Emily smiled faintly. "I just stopped hiding." The Foundation's reach expanded rapidly, not loudly, not with press releases, but through strategic partnerships. Companies eager to align with Bellamy values adjusted their practices. Others were quietly excluded. Emily didn't blacklist anyone. She simply didn't endorse them. And in the world Blake Harrington lived in, endorsement was oxygen. Blake felt it as irritation at first. A meeting postponed. An investor reconsidering timing. A partnership that suddenly required additional compliance reviews. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Markets fluctuate, he told himself. But then came the unanswered calls. Blake stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the city, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight. "I'm just asking for a follow-up," he snapped. "We've worked together for years." A pause. "I understand," came the reply. "It's just not the right fit anymore." The line went dead. Blake lowered the phone slowly. At lunch, he overheard two executives whispering near the bar. "Bellamy backed now. Can't afford the optics." Blake frowned. Bellamy. The name tickled something in his memory, but he dismissed it. Bellamy was old money. Philanthropy. Foundations. Not his world. Or so he thought. Weeks passed. His firm's numbers dipped, not catastrophically, but enough to unsettle his partners. Clients who once praised his vision now wanted safeguards. Legal reviews. Ethical audits. "You've never had issues before," one investor said cautiously. "But the landscape is changing." "What landscape?" Blake demanded. The man hesitated. "Reputation." Blake scoffed. "Mine is solid." The investor didn't argue. He simply didn't renew. Meanwhile, Emily worked late into the evenings, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She reviewed grant proposals personally. She visited manufacturing facilities without warning. She listened more than she spoke. Word spread quickly. Emily Bellamy didn't perform authority. She embodied it. Margaret Bellamy watched from a distance, satisfaction quiet but unmistakable. "You're doing exactly what I hoped," she told Emily one evening, voice weaker than before. Emily held her hand. "I learned from you." Margaret smiled. "You learned from being underestimated." That same night, Blake attended a private networking dinner, one he had once dominated. The room buzzed with polite conversation, but something felt off. People nodded instead of engaging. Smiles didn't linger. When Blake approached a former ally, the man excused himself within minutes. Later, Blake overheard his name spoken softly behind him. "Association risk. Not aligned." Blake's glass paused halfway to his lips. He turned sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" The conversation died instantly. A woman he barely recognized offered a stiff smile. "Just industry talk." Blake left early. At home, his home, now quiet and echoing, he poured himself a drink and stared out at the city lights. For the first time since the divorce, Emily crossed his mind not as a victory, but as an absence. She had always been calm, observant, quiet in a way he'd mistaken for weakness. He shook the thought away. Across town, Emily received an invitation. The Whitmore Gala, a closed event honoring global philanthropic leadership. Nathan glanced at the card. They're introducing you publicly. Emily inhaled slowly. So this is it. Nathan smiled. Ready. Emily thought of the courthouse. The laughter. The pen in her hand. Yes, she said. I am. The Bellamy Foundation finalized a series of strategic withdrawals the same week. One by one, firms that failed compliance reviews lost access to Bellamy-backed initiatives. Blake's firm was among them. The email was polite, professional, final. Blake stared at the screen in disbelief. "This is a mistake," he barked into the phone minutes later. "We've supported their initiatives for years." "I'm sorry," the representative said evenly. "The decision came from above." "From who?" Blake demanded. A pause. "Bellamy leadership." Blake's stomach tightened. That night, he pulled files, searched connections, read articles he'd ignored before. And there it was. Emily Bellamy, co-director, Bellamy Foundation. The photo loaded slowly. Blake felt the air leave his lungs. It was her. Not Emily Carter. Emily Bellamy. The woman he'd mocked. Dismissed. Signed away without hesitation. The room seemed to tilt. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." Memories resurfaced. Her refusal to take money, her indifference to status, the way she never defended herself when attacked. Not because she couldn't. Because she didn't need to. The realization hit harder than any loss. Emily hadn't walked away empty-handed. She had walked away intact. Blake's phone buzzed with another alert, a client terminating their contract. Then another. By the end of the week, Blake's partners called an emergency meeting. "This isn't personal," one of them said carefully. "But perception matters." Blake laughed bitterly. "Perception? You're not aligned anymore." Blake left the meeting knowing it was over. Emily stood in front of a mirror days later, adjusting the simple black gown chosen for the gala. No excessive jewelry. No statement pieces. Nathan watched from the doorway. You could shut half the room down just by showing up. Emily met her own reflection. "I'm not going to." She turned. "I just want the truth to exist." Nathan nodded. "That's more powerful." As Blake packed his office into boxes, the city skyline looked colder than before. The empire he'd built was crumbling, not through attack, but exclusion. And Emily Bellamy, the woman he had believed was nothing, was about to step into the light, publicly, unmistakably, without ever lifting a finger against him. The gala awaited. And so did the reckoning. The Whitmore Gala unfolded beneath a ceiling of soft gold light, the kind designed to flatter everyone beneath it. Crystal chandeliers reflected across marble floors, and conversations overlapped in smooth, confident tones. This was not a place for spectacle. It was a place where influence gathered quietly, where decisions were made long before applause ever followed. Blake Harrington stood near the edge of the room, drink untouched in his hand. He hadn't planned to come. In truth, he hadn't even been sure he still belonged here. But habit and desperation had carried him through the doors. The Whitmore Gala had once been his territory. He knew the faces, the rhythm, the unspoken rules. Tonight, everything felt slightly out of reach. People greeted him politely, but without warmth. Conversations stalled after a few sentences. Invitations to continue elsewhere never came. Blake told himself he was imagining it. Then the room shifted. Not with noise, but with attention. Blake followed the subtle turn of heads toward the entrance. Emily Bellamy stepped inside. She didn't arrive dramatically. No pause, no announcement. She wore a simple, elegant gown, dark, understated, perfectly fitted. Her hair was pulled back neatly. No excessive jewelry. No performance. She didn't need one. Nathan Bellamy walked beside her, calm and composed, greeting familiar faces. People moved toward them instinctively, not rushing, not crowding, just aligning. Blake's chest tightened. This wasn't the woman who had stood silently in a courthouse conference room. This wasn't the wife he had dismissed, corrected, talked over. This was someone entirely at ease. A host stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone gently. The room quieted almost immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said, smiling, "thank you for joining us tonight. This year's Whitmore Gala honors leadership that reshapes industries not through dominance, but through responsibility." Emily felt the moment settle around her. She clasped her hands lightly, breathing steady. "It is my privilege," the host continued, "to introduce the next generation of the Bellamy legacy." Blake's grip tightened around his glass. "Please welcome," the host said, "Emily Bellamy, co-director of the Bellamy Foundation." Applause filled the room. Genuine. Sustained. Blake stood frozen as Emily stepped forward. The light caught her face, not harshly, but clearly. She smiled, small and composed, then nodded once in acknowledgement. She didn't look at Blake. She didn't have to. Emily spoke briefly. She talked about ethical growth, about responsibility, about building systems that respected people rather than exploiting them. Her voice was calm, steady, unmistakably confident. As she spoke, Blake remembered every moment he had mistaken her silence for emptiness. When the applause returned, it felt louder than before. Blake couldn't breathe. The truth settled fully now, not as shock, but as clarity. Emily had never been beneath him. She had been beyond him. After the speeches, the room returned to its quiet hum. Emily was approached by executives, philanthropists, leaders who spoke to her as an equal. She listened, nodded, smiled. She asked thoughtful questions. Blake watched from across the room, unseen. When Emily finally turned, her eyes met his. Just once. There was no triumph in her expression. No anger. No satisfaction. Only recognition. And then she looked away. That was worse than any confrontation. Blake left early. The weeks that followed were unkind. His firm dissolved quietly. Partners exited. Assets were sold. The apartment he'd moved into after the divorce grew emptier with each passing day, not because things were removed, but because meaning was. Eventually, Blake took a job that paid the bills and little else. A warehouse on the edge of the city. Early mornings. Long hours. No one knew his name, and no one cared to. At first, he hated it. Then, slowly, the noise inside him softened. One evening, after a shift that left his hands sore and his back aching, Blake sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor. He thought about Emily, not as she had been to him, but as she had always been. He remembered her kindness when he'd been impatient, her steadiness when he'd been cruel, the way she never asked for more than respect, and how easily he had denied it. For the first time, Blake understood that he hadn't lost a fortune. He had lost a person of depth. Across the city, Emily stood on a balcony overlooking the ocean, the evening air cool against her skin. The Bellamy Foundation had just finalized a new initiative, one she believed in deeply. Ethan Pierce joined her, setting 2 mugs on the railing. "You're thinking," he said, smiling. Emily laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" Ethan shrugged. "Only when you're happy." She leaned into him. Ethan was nothing like Blake. He didn't compete. He didn't dominate. He listened. He created beauty with his hands and spoke with care. They had met through a foundation-supported textile project. No pretenses. No hierarchy. Just mutual respect. "I don't miss it," Emily said quietly. "The life I left." Ethan nodded. "You didn't belong there anymore." Emily looked out at the horizon. "I needed to lose everything I thought mattered to understand what actually did." Months later, Emily and Ethan married quietly. No press. No spectacle. Only family, close friends, and intention. Margaret Bellamy watched from her chair, frail now but smiling, pride unmistakable in her eyes. "You found your way," she told Emily softly. Emily squeezed her hand. "Because you let me." The world moved on. The Bellamy Foundation flourished. Ethical standards became expectations. Influence reshaped itself, not through fear, but through alignment. And Blake Harrington learned to live with what remained. Not bitterness. Not blame. just understanding. Some lessons arrive too late to save what was lost, but right on time to change who we become. And Emily Bellamy, once mocked and dismissed, lived not as proof of revenge, but as evidence that quiet strength endures.